Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and a special welcome to my fellow literary adventurers. It's that time of year again when I share with you the upcoming reading list to my Patreon community, The Great Literary Adventure. As is usual, I'm going to give you 6 books for the first 6 months of 2025 and the reason why they're being picked. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? So if you've belonged to my Patreon group, The Great Literary Journey, before, or if you've watched some of these videos on the upcoming reading list, you'll know that I like to construct the reading list around a 3-month idea. So 1 book per month for 3 months where we dip into something so that we can immerse ourselves in a certain feel. Now, from January to March, we're taking a look at Japanese classics, something I know many of you are interested in. And me too, I want to expand my journey in literature this way as well. To that end, the very first book of 2025 in our reading group is The Honjin Murders by Seishi Yokomitsu. Now, this book is actually such a really good murder mystery. There's a few reasons I've plucked for it, and you'll see why further along in the list. But firstly, Yokomitsu is one of the leading, most admired mystery writers in the Japanese canon. So it'll be interesting just to look there. And if you really like this book, there are many more that they write. But also, it's a short book, and in the first month of a year, it's really important, I find, to get a book out of the way. And I don't just mean to dismiss it, but to get one under your belt. It's encouraging for you to get a book. It gets you out of a reading slump. And mysteries tend to be quite fast-paced, intriguing, they keep your attention, and as it's only about 200 pages, you can clear it quite quickly. Now, there's one other reason for this book, but we'll come to that in February's selection. So, what is The Honjin Murders about? Well, imagine this. A well-to-do family at the edge of a peasant village is having a marriage, and everybody's excited. The night of the marriage, the bride and groom move to the annex building in the estate. In the middle of the night, about 3 in the morning in fact, there is a blood-curdling scream that pierces the night air. And then, strangely, the twanging of a string instrument. Twice, in fact. When people arrive on the scene, all of the doors and windows are locked from the inside. There seems to be no evidence of someone coming or going, but inside are the bride and groom murdered, and the only clue seems to be a katana stuck in the snow outside. It's a classic locked room mystery, and our detective Kindaichi is an amateur sleuth who has to start picking at the very small threads at the edge of the evidence in order to work out what has happened, how an impossible crime seems to have been committed. So that's the story of the Honjin Murders. How is it worked out? In our discussion of it, we'll probably be more interested in taking a look at why we're fascinated with mysteries, but also specifically lessons in the style that Yokomitsu uses in order to create his atmosphere and effect, his approach towards a very popular genre, and what makes him a classic in the Japanese canon. So that was the first one, The Honjin Murders. February's book, our second book for 2025, is a highly acclaimed classic by a very highly acclaimed Japanese author, and it is The Makioka Sisters by Junichiro Tanizaki. Now, the reason this comes in February is because it's the biggest of the 6 books that we're reading for the year, coming in at about 580 pages. So having a short book in January will allow us all to be able to finish that. And if you want to start this book because you need more time to get through 500 pages, then we'll have it. Now, this is a contemplative book. This is what I refer to as the serious classics, the ones that really try to plumb the depths of either the humanity, the human experience, individuality, maybe not individuality, maybe the collectivism, or a specific trait. Now, in this story, we have the three Makioka sisters, and I'm trying to remember their names. They live in Osaka. They're part of an upper middle class family. And it's Tsuruko, Sachiko, and Yukiko is the youngest. The first two are married, but Yukiko is not married. And because they hold on to the pride and esteem of their family, who live in Osaka, and are one of the most notable families, they have rejected numerous requests for marriage for the younger daughter. But this is taking place at the latter end of the 30s, 1930s to 1941, as the old way of life in Japan is dying off. The traditions or the traditional families and how things are approached are dying off, but how a family wants to cling to those memories and is struggling to adjust. And with obviously the impending aspect of World War II and maybe occupation by the Allies, all of that features in here. And apparently we're given a really good exploration of life in an upper middle class family at that time, and the difficulties we as humans must deal with in a changing world. And specifically the quality of pride is pointed out in this, and the dangers that come from it, and how it can be an undoing, a hamasha, as we frequently refer to it. So that's the Makioka sisters. I've not read this one, but I know it's big on the list of Japanese classics to read, and so we'll be reading it in February. March's read promises to be a great one. It is Kokoro, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, by Natsumi Soseki. Now, Soseki is arguably Japan's national author from my research and listening to other people talk about Japanese literature. And of all the works, Kokoro, which I think means is roughly translated heart, is the most famous one, although it's not the most famous in Japanese classic literature, which from my research tends to agree on the tale of Genji, but that's far too big to read in a month. So Kokoro, we have our narrator. He goes to a town because his friend has invited them there, but now he's left alone with not much to do. And one day he sees an old man getting changed with a foreign man before they head down to the sea, to the beach. And then every day afterwards, our narrator sees this old man, but this time he's alone. And eventually, the narrator makes contact, finds a way to introduce himself. Listening to this old man, our narrator begins to call him sensei. We don't get his name. That means master, teacher, I think. And he becomes very attached to this old man who there's a certain reserve, a certain distance kept. Now eventually they have to part and the sensei goes back to Tokyo, where our narrator eventually goes. I'll say no more, but he wants to be with his sensei. But his sensei has a secret from his past, which will eventually come to light through the book. This is an exploration, I've been told, of sadness, loneliness, isolation, which makes for great introspection. And truly great literature makes you look inward. And to see this from a cultural difference as well, I'm really excited to read it, especially as has high acclaim as it seems to have in practically every time I look up the great classics of the Japanese canon. Kokoro keeps coming up, like as either one or two. And so we're going to be taking a look at that. And that leads me on to the next three of our books and the category that they're tied around, well, at least two of them. And it's the category of relationships, as in sisters or brothers, and the passing of time and introspection. maybe a bit of loneliness or isolation at times. Remember, we've already had Makioka Sisters in February, and that is going to feed quite nicely into April and May's reading. So let's get to those. April's book is the wonderful Howard's End by E.M. Forster. Now, we have read one of Forster's books in the group before. That was A Room with a View, and so many in the community absolutely loved it. It was their first introduction to E.M. Forster. Now, E.M. Forster is probably most well known for A Passage to India, but many in fact, argue that Howard's End is Forster's greatest work. Now, it fits in with this theme of family relations, societal issues, the pecking order in society, and the travails that we all individually have to go through in rubbing up against each other. So in here you have the three Schlegel sisters, so that will be interesting, considering of the three Makioka sisters. How are they approached by different authors? You also have the Wilcoxes, a very well-to-do English family, and you have the Basts, who are poor. Now, the Schlegels had met the Wilcoxes while the Wilcoxes were on tour in Germany, and eventually the Schlegels have come back to Britain, and there's an intricacy between them and the Wilcoxes, let's say, which I'm not going to give anything away. Eventually, they come to be very close side by side, neighbours of each other, but also the Basts. Now, the Basts are quite a big divide from the Wilcoxes in the social ranking. The Schlegels sit somewhere between, and it's the interaction and the difficulties and the prejudices of social movement. Forster was Edwardian, and so much of his writing focuses on the constraints of society, the difficulty of being an individual, whereas you have to conform to a collective way of morality, ethics, conduct, whatever's perceived to be the right thing. And so Forster explores the lives of these characters, centering primarily on the Schlegel sisters. The one thing about Forster is the beauty of his writing. This is at the period of the modernist movements, and this straightforward, direct way of stripping away a lot of ornamentation and going for a straightforward story, but slightly stream of consciousness as well. Now, Forster doesn't go fully to stream of consciousness like Woolf, for instance, but you get that sense of psychology going on. You sense the pain of thought that happens within all of us through this book. And I can't wait for us to look at this as a group, especially as we'll have read the Makioka Sisters. Now, will there be, as I've not read the Makioka Sisters, will there be some matching? Will we see the universal themes which demonstrate literature is not divided by race or culture, because human beings at the very root have the most fundamental needs and feel the same fundamental pains as one another? So that will be April's read, Howard's End by E.M. Forster. May's book, that's the fifth one on the list, is going to be a bit of a pleasant change in style, but still revolving around the same topics of family, a touch of isolation, relationships, and society itself and its expectations. And that is by the somewhat forgotten classic writer and Virginia Woolf's close friend, Vita Sackville-West. And this is her most famous work, All Passion Spent. Some of you may have already read this. So in this book, we come at it from a perspective of age. Sackville-West herself, she said to her children that this was a book which focused on age because people can be forgotten and yet they had great lives. Now, I'll just say right here, I was considering Arnold Bennett's The Old Wives' Tale, but running at over 700 pages, I thought it may be a bit of a big ask because people are busy. Now, in this, the protagonist, Lady Slane, we follow her life after her husband, who was once Viceroy of India. So she's very, high status. He's died. And the children are all talking about how to take care of mother, and sorting out the family estate and everything. When Lady Selene decides to take it upon herself to quit her home in Kensington and move to a small cottage in Hampstead, which she had seen like many years earlier. This shocks the family because that's not where they expect their mother to go, and she's not falling in line with their plans. And so begins Lady Selene's developing of friendships and relationships with the people around her and the area around about her, and then becomes reflective of past events, thinking of memories, and questioning the impositions that are placed upon us as humans, and the need for each human to have their rights. It's not a polemic, it's not political, but it's a proper reflection on a life lived and the wisdom that comes from living, several decades, and being able to start looking at the world, which is often youth-focused, but to look at it from the advantage or the vantage point of age. And so that's going to be a bit of a different style for the majority if you've never read Sackville West. Like I say, a friend of Virginia Woolf's, very close friend. And that's what we're going to be reading in May. It's also very short. Again, we're talking around, probably under 200 pages. This book runs to 300, but if I show you the setup, large font, massive margins, whole space missing here at the bottom. It's not the longest book, and that sets us up quite nicely for June's read. Now, June's read breaks away from the mould and has more in common with the Hunjin murders than anything else. It's a mystery, but it's not a murder mystery, and it's by one of the greatest mystery writers in the English language ever to have written, someone with a real knack for plotting, like a real plotter. We've read this author before to universally praised comments of the book, and it is Wilkie Collins. Now, the last book we read in the group of his was The Woman in White, a brilliant Gothic novel. This is The Moonstone. Now, Wilkie Collins, bit of a background in the law, and we noticed in The Woman in White this use of different narrative perspectives. Different people were writing at different points, as if the lawyer had gathered up the evidence to create the case. Collins does the same in The Moonstone. Now, the story is of a yellow diamond, which once was in one of the gods, the head of one of the gods in a temple in India. But when the British went over and conquered India, this moonstone was stolen. It starts with the raiding of the palace of Seringapatam. Now, that moonstone would find its way back to Britain, back to one of the families. But some of the priests of the deity, I think it was Brahman, have always been sworn to look out and protect the moonstone, and so they try and follow it around. Now, that's the background. What really becomes intriguing is how the moonstone goes missing at the home in Britain, and no one seems to know where it's gone. And in comes a detective, one of the first real detectives in English literature, at least on the British side. And he gathers information and tries to piece together what has happened by taking the accounts of individual different characters, just like Collins does in The Woman in White. Only this is with someone particularly asking them, could you write down your testimony, please? And in a way only Wilkie Collins can do, he draws you in to like absolute fascination. Even though it's not a murder, you're just thinking, where on earth has this thing gone? And of course, some interesting characters turn up near the village where the house is. So I'm not going to say any more. This is a book I'm pretty sure, again, this is a book I could recommend to like absolutely anybody to read, because it's quite gripping, it moves at a brisk pace. It's actually a bit shorter than The Woman in White, not too much. This is about 470 pages, so you'll appreciate why I've put Sackville West in May's read, because you'll get through that faster and you can start beforehand if you think you might need a bit more than 4 weeks to read the Moonstone. But you won't regret reading the Moonstone, and we'll be taking a look, like we did with the Hunjin murders, at maybe how a mystery is developed. Part of our literary adventure, one, it's to take the meanings for life, the great ponderous thoughts that people have had and dwelt upon, but also in our great literary adventure, we want to understand style, we want to understand plotting, we want to pull apart how effect is created by an author. And one of the best ways to do that is to read the great authors who are deliberately trying to manipulate sensations. Wilkie Collins is one of them. So that was June's read, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. So there you are. That's the first 6 months books for our reading list in the Great Literary Adventure in Patreon. Feel free to come over and join right now. We're currently going through Larkrise to Candleford. We have Time Will Darken It coming in November, and we have Cranford in December, because we've been exploring the rural book in literature and, you know, its place in our heart as humans. So I hope you've enjoyed these. Just to recap, what were they again? There was the Hunjin murders, followed by the Makioka sisters by Tanizaki. Then we've got Kokoro by Soseki. Then we're moving on to Howard's End by an author we've already read, which is E.M. Forster. Then Sackville West's All Passions Spent, and finishing off with the great mystery, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Until the next time I see you, I wish you joy in whatever you read.